So hello everyone, thanks for coming. So I'm going to talk about some work that we did in last year or so, which is about providing an HCI perspective on provenance, and specifically the W3C's PROV standard, and we did that through an online game. Now, I was going to introduce what provenance is, but Dimitri did a good job at that. And you'd think I would have known that since we work in the same lab. But so basically, yeah, provenance is a record of the history of a piece of object. It's sometimes, especially in the world of art, it's equally important to the object itself in terms of who painted the painting, who owned it before, all that stuff. It's quite a significant sort of factor in terms of determining the value of an object. And I'm here to talk about an HCI issue there, and the question is, how is this an HCI issue? So the World Wide Web Consortium in May 2013 released, they have a working group on provenance, and they released a specification that governs how provenance will be handled and in the digital age. Including this definition, provenance is a record that describes the people, institutions, entities, and activities involved in producing, influencing, or delivering a piece of data or thing. So it's pretty all-encompassing and covers pretty much everything that has to do with the history of an object, in terms of, especially in terms of how it came to be and what are the people or institutions or things that were a factor in that. So in addition to the definition itself, they proposed a standard, a specification for a new data model to standardize how provenance is presented in the digital age. They call the model PROV, and at its core, it's quite simple actually. So you have three types of nodes: agent nodes, entity nodes, activity nodes. Entities are any kind of object that you might experience in. Usually, it's more focused on online things like documents, videos, images. An agent is any person, organization, institution, even piece of software that created an object and can influence its existence. Activities are the process by which these things happen, the process by which an agent can affect an entity. And they define a whole set of relationships that can apply to them, such as an entity can be derived from another entity can be attributed to an agent, etc. So it's quite simple if you look at it, but its instantiations can get really complex. And if you look at this thing and you think, that's pretty impossible for a human being to actually read that. And that's sort of fine, because when the W3C proposed the PROV standard, they did not intend it as a human-readable thing. They meant it as a machine-readable format that is used to exchange information between machines about where things come from. And it's all meant to be processed by applications or sort of software that run in the background and try to understand what things are. In fact, originally, the model actually itself is defined in text format, and the graphical presentation of it is actually almost an afterthought. And it's meant just to illustrate things and as a teaching thing. So that said, things kind of change because certain organizations, such as the Gazette, which is the official public record of the United Kingdom, they sort of release information about Act of Parliament and new laws and stuff. And they started proposing these provenance trail using the PROV model to sort of indicate where the laws are coming from, what laws are influencing other laws, and what sort of activities are happening there. And this is meant to be a publicly accessible site, so it's meant for the general public. People can go on there, click on this provenance trail, see where this act is coming from. And this is not the only people who are doing that. The National Climate Assessment in the United States also uses provenance, uses the PROV data standard to inform on where its data is coming from. So this makes us sort of ask the question, how accessible is the PROV model, which was originally intended as a machine-readable format? How accessible is it for a human being? And not a sort of an expert on provenance, but someone who is a non-expert who is just interested in the topic that the provenance is about. We also set out to understand users' perceptions and attitudes towards provenance as in principle, just the idea of recording all this information in such detail, and particularly exploring the ethical and social issues that arise when provenance data is captured and used in the real world. So in order to begin to answer these issues, we have to sort of expose people to provenance and the PROV model. And we need to get them engaged enough with it in order to actually make an informed opinion about it rather than just talk about it very briefly. So our first challenge was, how do you get non-experts to engage with provenance and the PROV model? And if you remember, if you look at this, after all, no one would actually want to look at that voluntarily unless they're really passionate about linked data, which most people aren't. So that's when we came up with the idea of creating a game that uses the PROV model as as a core gameplay mechanic. And we used that sort of, we did that to sort of harness the power of games, motivating people to actually stick with it and try to understand what's going on. And I wanted to present it in sort of playful manner that wouldn't alienate majority of the population. So we teamed up with a group of artists in Nottingham and we designed a game called The Apocalypse of Mop. It's an online game, purely browser-based. It was launched in December 13, lasted 7 months. And its gameplay is built entirely on the PROV standard. So the game was episodic in nature. There were, every few weeks, a new episode would be released with a new mission that the players have to accomplish. And while they do that, over the period of 7 months, they start getting bits of the narrative. And it's sort of an interactive kind of narrative where every episode has a new bit of something happened in the storyline, and they kind of follow that through the game. So I'll talk briefly about that as well. So at the core of the storyline is this organization called the Ministry of Provenance. And this organization is sort of like a sinister Orwellian, big brothery type organization that monitors everything, records everything, has records about every aspect of everyone's lives. They keep records on speeding tickets, orphan adoptions, school report cards, birth, death certificates, pretty much anything that is relevant to people's lives. They just store it in a massive archive that they just keep at in their sort of giant data centers. And opposed to those guys is a group of sort of like a collective hackers, activists who form a secretive underground resistance movement to fight the ministry's sort of dominance on information, and they're trying to expose certain things that the ministry is doing that seem to be sort of beyond its stated goal of collecting information. So the game basically goes like this. You join Cron as an agent, and you're introduced to the storyline by a character called the Groundsman, who just pops up very often in videos explaining the story as it goes along. He gives you missions and instructions on what to do next, and how to help bring about the demise of this Ministry of Provenance. The first mission that you have to do as a member of Cron is to infiltrate the ministry by joining their sort of work-at-home scheme, which is a crowdsourcing effort by the ministry to help maintain the integrity of its data. So it allows anyone to go online from home, go through some of the sort of like the less security-sensitive elements of the archive, and try to help making sure that there are no errors in them. And they do that by joining this open recruitment for citizen helpers and internal deployment scheme, which, as you can see, it looks like a very sort of like a bland, sort of old-school office intranet design. It's all very bureaucratic. It's very tedious. You have to send forms to get something, and when you send a form, sometimes you say, oh, this is the wrong form, please send another form, and it's all very kind of designed to be a bit dull and office-like. So when people join that thing, the first thing they get is an orientation process where they are introduced to the basic concepts of provenance and the PROV standard. So they're introduced to what nodes are, what entities and activities and agents are, and they're taught how to sort of do their job at the ministry by understanding all these events and what they can do with them. They're also given a form in game where they can request help from the ministry's orientation officer, Sandy Spencer, who is sort of like an in-game character that they can interact with to get help without having to sort of break the immersion and request help from technical support. So they'd email Sandy, and she'd respond in character, telling them, oh, you should do this, you should do that. And there's a sort of equivalent version of that at the Cron site, so they can ask the groundsman for help, and the groundsman would respond and do that stuff. So what they'd actually do on a day-to-day basis at the ministry is examine provenance graphs. So they start off with simple ones, just 3 or 4 nodes. They look at the provenance graph, they lay it out on a browser interface, they lay out the graph, they examine the individual attributes of each node, and they try to find if there's something wrong. Not sure if that's it. So in this case, there's an error, for example, in the fact that the car registration number in 2 of the nodes doesn't actually match. So it's sort of like a spot the difference type mechanic. It's fairly simple, but it still requires you to understand what the nodes mean and what the arrows mean, and get an idea of what the whole graph is trying to say. And then correctly identifying errors, gives them points, trust points. They use the trust points to level up, and the higher they go in the clearance, the higher their the sensitivity of documents they can access. So eventually start accessing things like weapons trading deals and sort of citizen re-education programs and stuff like that. And they get sort of idea of what's really going on. But in addition to going up in the clearance, they also used the trust to exploit the vulnerability in MOP system, where they extract documents that go back to cron. So the grounds would say, I need this document because it's important for our mission, and those documents tend to be fairly complex graphs where it reveals a narrative point. So it reveals that the ministry actually hid a certain historical event because they wanted to cover up something that happened. And they'd basically go online at the ministry, use their trust to access these documents. These documents are sort of at the core of the narrative. So the story itself is offered to the players through provenance graphs. This is for one of the early ones where they discovered that they examined the provenance of a transcript of an audio record, of an emergency call, sorry, and they find out that somewhere along the provenance trail, someone had dropped 2 lines from the transcript, and which isn't evident from looking at the transcript itself, but it's only evidence from looking at the provenance of the transcript. And those 2 lines that were removed would actually indicate that there was a black van near the site of the crime. That black van later on turns out to be a clue to something else in the storyline. So they do these every time they unlock a new mission, they complete it. Every time they complete it, they unlock a new piece of narrative, and the story continues to go forward like that, going to MOP, going to the ministry, doing their job, gaining trust, unlocking new missions, unlocking new that, and then at the end, sort of, there's this climactic finale where the narrative sort of comes to an end. So that's pretty much it for the game itself. Some of our sort of basic results. So we got about 900 people who signed up to the game. We allowed people to sign up to the game without consenting for the research because we wanted it to be sort of more widely spread. About 495 people consented to the research, so these are the ones whose data we actually analyzed. In this particular paper and in this presentation, I'll focus on some of the interviews that we made, which is so it's going to be more qualitative kind of analysis of what we did. We conducted 8 interviews with some of the players, sort of in-depth, hour-long interviews with some of the more active players who didn't just quit at the beginning, because a lot of people did. And we also had questionnaires that we gave out to everyone who joined, and about 40 people replied. So the average age of all participants was 28. A fairly small percent of them were female. We're not quite sure why. And the 30% of the participants had heard of provenance before as a concept, but none of them had heard of the PROV model, which is not surprising so much. So basic results, so as far as the accessibility of the model is concerned, we found that only 5% found learning about provenance and the PROV model difficult. The majority of players found it easy or very easy, with the rest being neutral. In addition, they completed about 12,500 PROV graphs at the ministry, with a pretty high success rate of 96.6%, and a median time of 1.30 seconds, 1 minute 30 seconds. They also solved 740 cron cases, most of which were provenance graphs, some of which were just basic puzzle type things. And on these ones, there was no chance of failure, because if you fail, you can't move forward. So the median time for those was 15 minutes, as they were fairly more complex. So some of the basic, just go through 3 of the basic key things that we found out. The first one was that the arrows sort of on the graph seem to be very counterintuitive, because the arrows point towards the source of influence in these graphs. The majority of players felt that this is actually very confusing. They think when you're looking at data flow in a graph, you want your arrows to point forward. So they often just stopped looking at the arrows completely. They found them to be confusing and counterintuitive. So basically, as a recommendation for designing interfaces for non-experts in terms of that display provenance, it might be wise to sort of abandon this backwards arrow pointing and use something a bit more intuitive for people. The participants also pointed out that they could immediately see a value in using provenance data in the real world. They saw that it is extremely useful as a tool for verifiability and accountability. They talked a lot about news, media, sort of the current news and citizen journalism, and how a lot of times they don't really know if this piece of information is actually valid or not when they're looking at it online. They found that if I had a clear idea of provenance about who wrote it, where they got the information from, that'd be very useful. So they could immediately see the kind of usability of that. They also pointed out different other domains where they work, specifically, for example, financial audit trails or scientific sort of fraud detection. Everyone was able to sort of find a location where they felt that the use of provenance would be extremely valuable. But at the same time, when sort of asked about what they think about provenance used in their personal lives, they were fairly understandably uneasy. And so one thing that sort of popped up was this sort of idea that provenance data is inherently data about the past. It's not just who you are right now is what led you to be who you are right now, and everything about that. And so when you think about maintaining data about yourself, that's fine. Maintaining provenance data about yourself means you kind of lose your ability to delete that history, because that history becomes part of that data. And so participants were quite aware of that, and they felt that while they're happy to sort of have some data about them recorded, provenance data seems to sort of cross the line because it kind of eliminates their ability to alter their own histories, which is something that is sort of more and more seen as an important part of our rights as citizens. So just a quick summary. When we use the game to study the PROV standard, we found out 3 basic things. One, that it's accessible. It is actually accessible. It is usable as a medium to disseminate information to the public. It is necessary in certain domains as a tool for verifiability and accountability, but it's also very invasive, more invasive than other types of data when it's used for the private lives. And the arrows are pointing the wrong way. Thanks a lot. I'd like to thank my co-authors, Martin, Richard, Tom, Dong, and Luke. Also, I'd like to thank Dom and Adam of Urban Angel and the rest of their team for the great work they did in actually providing all the art and all the narrative of the game that we've made. So thanks.
Jenny Pun from UCL. I'm just wondering if you've got any future plans for this work. The game is now closed. Will it be possible to play it again? Because I'd like to play it. And what are you doing in the future with it? What's your next steps?
So the game itself is closed, yeah, because the main reason for that is that, as I said, there are some characters in the game that do need constant human interaction. So when someone sends an email to Sandy Spencer, someone actually has to be on the line and reply, and we kind of can't really maintain that forever. So what we're planning on doing right now is looking at the data that we currently have and continuing working with that. I don't think there will be a MOP 2, but there will be, we did log a lot of data that we have in the game. So we logged all the interactions players did with provenance graphs. We had a lot more things than the data that we couldn't really fit into this paper. So it's going to be more about just analyzing data we currently have rather than building forward on the game itself.
Hi, Eva Luger, Microsoft Research. I'm just curious, because it's a game, and it looked really exciting and interesting. I thought it was fantastic. But what components do you think would be transferable to help people genuinely understand data provenance within the real world? So which components could you actually make usable on a day-to-day basis? One of the issues that we had in terms of the limitations of using a game is that by nature of the narrative, we kind of presented provenance as a negative thing. So it's a tool of oppression rather than, and that was kind of came out in the interview. Some people actually thought the provenance is just a way of hiding data, which isn't really. It's kind of the opposite. So it's kind of hard to actually see how this. Some of the actual. Most of the responses did indicate that the people actually saw this as just an illustration of what provenance is rather than what it actually is. And they kind of saw this as for what it really was. And when we asked them to describe provenance for us, they were really very sort of context-independent definitions of provenance, and they kind of understood what it actually meant. And then they did kind of really see how it applies to their own jobs and to their own careers. And they talked about individual instances in their lives where this type of data actually is useful. So I think they were able to extract from. They knew it was a game, and they kind of understood that, and they were able to extract from the game the key ideas that that they saw in the provenance, and they were able to sort of apply that outside the game, sort of like they were able to generalize beyond its use in the game. And that sort of answered something.
That's great, thank you.
Dennis Wixon from USC. It occurs to me that most of the provenance that occurs in the real world is often kind of benign or mildly positive. You know, people are recording the history of a building or their home, or while in this game, the institution was a somewhat sinister institution. So I'm wondering how one can generalize the experiences that you found in the game to naturally occurring sort of, in a certain sense, I'm asking about the ecological validity of the study that you've done.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of similar to what I was saying. So yes, the players did see provenance in sort of a darker light than they would normally. They did experience provenance as a tool used by a bad organization, but from the interviews, we kind of did not get the sense that they took that with them when they're thinking about provenance as it is. So most of the times they talked about provenance, they said about, oh yeah, it'll be great if we apply to this, or it'll be great if we apply to that, or it'll be great if we apply to this. So it wasn't so much, this sort of negativity did not really go with them. But I see, I mean, I completely see the concern that this might be this might affect the validity of the study in that sense. But it is meant to be a sort of like exploratory approach to look at what people actually think in terms of what are the basic ideas they have in terms of provenance and principle.
Well, one suggestion I might make if you're going for future research is to flip the design intent around so that the recording is a positive thing and the destruction is a negative thing. So, you know, in other words, make the sort of vandalism as sinister as opposed to the recording of events as sinister.
Yeah, that was a good idea, thanks.
All right, let's thank Khaled again.